All right. Hey, everyone. Last event of the day. Thank you very, very much for showing up. I see some Protocol Guild members. Thank you for representing. Yeah, thanks to the ECC organizers for having me here today. I am Cheeky Gorilla, and I'm here to talk to you about the Protocol Guild. But before we get started, how many of you have heard of the Protocol Guild before? Whoa, that's more than I expected. Then you'll know all of this already. Enjoy. Right, so over the next 20 or so minutes, we'll talk about what is the Protocol Guild, why it needs to exist, then I'll tell you about our one-year pilot, which actually just ended, and then I'll give you a sneak peek into what we have planned for after the pilot. But before we talk about the Protocol Guild, let's talk about Ethereum, specifically Ethereum's vision. Now, I'm sure that each of you have your own unique take on what Ethereum's vision is or should be, but one vision could be for Ethereum to be a global network that empowers individuals, right? A protocol for human coordination, something that is uniquely enabled via programmable incentives in a way that was never really possible before. But for this vision to become a reality, for Ethereum to really maximize its impact, what needs to happen is we need to incentivize talented individuals from all over the world to contribute to this open source project. But that's easier said than done. And that's exactly why the Protocol Guild was created, to essentially enable a funding mechanism that can be used by Ethereum's ecosystem and its community to very easily and hopefully sustainably fund Ethereum's core protocol work in a way that also provides compelling incentives to onboard and retain these contributors over the long term. But let's take a step back. Why is this even needed in the first place? And as I'm sure all of you already know, financial incentives are never aligned towards public goods. And the same thing applies to Ethereum's core protocol development, which is a public good. Today, the vast majority of funding for this work comes from a handful of entities. And unfortunately, they only provide a fraction of the financial incentives that are otherwise available in the ecosystem. For example, working for projects with tokens like apps or layer 2s. So essentially, we have the situation where Ethereum has enabled a massive ecosystem of very valuable projects to be built on top of it. Now, in an ideal world, wouldn't it be amazing if some of that value were to flow back to help support the core protocol development that all these projects depend on? And yet, even if that were the case, even if all these projects did want to help support Ethereum's core protocol development, how would you design a mechanism to distribute that funding, right? In a way that's reasonably accurate over time, in a way that's sufficiently fair, and perhaps most importantly, in a way that retains Ethereum's credible neutrality. Imagine you were put in charge of distributing ecosystem funding to Ethereum's core protocol contributors. What would you do? Would you perhaps go to Gitcoin? Try to find all the various core protocol teams and donate to them there? Would you get more involved? Would you go to the ETH R&D Discord, the Ethereum Magicians Forum, the Ethereum GitHub, and basically try to assimilate a list of all these contributors and then somehow track down donation addresses for each one? How do you make sure you don't miss anyone? How do you make sure you don't incorrectly identify someone as an active contributor when in fact they are no longer actively contributing? For example, if you cheat and ask ChatGPT for such a list, it will mention Gavin Wood, which, he hasn't exactly been active in Ethereum for a number of years now. The point that I'm trying to make is that identifying this contributor set is hard. Most people don't have the necessary context to do so. And to really emphasize this point, let's play a little game. By show of hands, how many of you can name one of Ethereum's core protocol contributors? There's some without hands up. Listen, if you've ever heard of the name Justin Drake, Danny Ryan, Vitalik Buterin, your hand should be up right now. Yeah, most of you, fantastic. Keep your hand up if you can name 10 of Ethereum's core protocol contributors. Protocol Guild members, stop cheating. Keep your hand up if you can name 50 of these core protocol contributors. They're Protocol Guild members, ignore them. Is there anyone here who can name 142 of Ethereum's core protocol contributors? Protocol Guild members? No, interesting. Why 142? Because today, the Protocol Guild has a list of 142 members. Each member represents an individual who is actively contributing to Ethereum's core protocol development. Now, there were a few of you superstars who said you could identify some of these individuals on that list, which is amazing, But I guess my question to you is, would you still be able to do this a few months from now? Imagine we're in November 2023. Will you be following Ethereum's core protocol development closely enough to be able to identify changes to this contributor set over time? What about a few years from now? Imagine we're in 2030. Will you still have a pulse on Ethereum's core protocol development? The point that I'm trying to make now is that tracking these contributors over time is also very difficult. Fortunately, the Protocol Guild has a solution. And at the core of the Protocol Guild is a list, a membership registry of Ethereum's active core protocol contributors. Today, this list has 142 individuals. These are all their names. These are individuals from all over the world, all of whom have been actively contributing to Ethereum's core protocol development for at least 6 months. Now, I should probably call out, this does not represent Ethereum's core protocol contributor set, the entirety of it. There are some more, but membership to the Protocol Guild is voluntary. It's opt-in. No one is obligated to join. Now, in isolation, this list of names is not super useful, so let's give it a little bit more context. These individuals are involved in all of the various functions related to building and maintaining Ethereum's core protocol. This includes research, testing, security, implementation, coordination. They come from over 20 different ecosystem teams. You may have heard of research groups like the Robust Incentive Group. You may have heard of coordination teams like the Ethereum Cat Herders. You may have heard of client teams like Geth and Aragon or Besu and Lighthouse. But the fact that some of these members are part of a team is actually irrelevant, right? Membership is centered around individuals, not teams, so that these members have the flexibility to work independently if they want to. Here we go. What makes this list special, what makes it more than just a list, is that it combines specific assurances and capabilities that ultimately make it an ideal funding mechanism for Ethereum's core protocol development. Something that can be used by Ethereum's ecosystem and its community to fund this work in a very unique way that takes into consideration the past, the present, and the future. So let's look at what some of those assurances are. Number one, as you might expect, this list, this membership registry is on-chain. And that enables the funding mechanism because this on-chain membership registry is tied to a single Ethereum address that anyone can send funds to. So think about how much complexity has been abstracted away here for potential donors. We're providing a single Ethereum address that anyone can use to donate directly to 142 of Ethereum's core protocol contributors. But I hear you ask, how is that funding distributed? In part, it's distributed via a retroactive time weighting, which is a very fancy way of saying that the longer a member has been contributing, the higher their share of donated funds. And so this time weighting is actually a square root function of the number of months a contributor has been contributing, multiplied by either 1 or 0.5, depending on if they've been working full-time or part-time. Retroactive time weighting is really important because it essentially allows us to recognize past contributions by these members and reward them accordingly. But distribution isn't only retroactive, it's also forward-looking. And it's forward-looking because it uses a vesting module to trustlessly distribute these funds to the membership over time. During our pilot, the vesting period was 1 year. After the pilot, we plan on increasing it to 4 years. Vesting is important because it gives assurances to donors that their entire donation won't just be spent all in one go, right? Rather, it'll slowly be distributed over time to these contributors, which creates long-term incentives for them to continue contributing. This facilitates knowledge handover and reduces membership churn, contributor churn. So now you know how this list can be used to receive funding and how that funding is distributed. But one very important thing, who maintains this list? And this list is actually self-curated. And by that I mean it is the existing members that coordinate to add or remove members. And this is incredibly important because honestly, for the Protocol Guild to have any legitimacy, this list needs to be accurate, right? Otherwise, what's the point? And the reality is, most individuals do not have the necessary context, do not have the necessary domain expertise to be able to curate this list. Even me, I spend almost every day thinking about the Protocol Guild, and I cannot name all 142 contributors. So in that same vein, we really cannot expect an external entity or organization to both create this list and maintain it over time. On the other hand, Protocol Guild members, who again are Ethereum's core protocol contributors, due to the very nature of their day-to-day job, they have all the necessary context. They have all the necessary domain expertise to be able to curate this list. So by delegating the responsibility of curation to the membership, we have the highest assurances that this list will remain accurate, both now and in the future. Another interesting attribute is that this list is inclusive. We encourage donations in ecosystem tokens, right? Not just ETH. The more that different tokens are donated, the more that these core protocol contributors get to benefit from the financial upside of tokens in Ethereum's ecosystem while remaining focused on their core protocol work. So in essence, everyone gets to benefit from each other's success. The last attribute that I'll highlight for you today is that this is a neutral list. As the name implies, the Protocol Guild seeks to fund the protocol and not features of the protocol. This is why membership eligibility is broad enough to include all the various functions related to building and maintaining Ethereum's core protocol, but nothing beyond that, and also why all those functions are weighted equally. We really don't want to get into a situation where a wealthy entity comes in and sends funding towards specific features of the protocol that benefit them at the expense of other core protocol functions. So, for all those different reasons, we like to think of the Protocol Guild as kind of like a magic list, something that is uniquely tailored to its purpose of very easily and very effectively funding Ethereum's core protocol development. And accordingly, we would encourage Ethereum's ecosystem and community to use the Protocol Guild as kind of like an open API for funding this work. But I hear you thinking, why should I donate? I don't want to donate. Let me give you a couple reasons. Number one, if you've built on Ethereum in any way, you have a dependency on it, right? It might be for data availability, it might be for uptime, whatever else. By donating to the Protocol Guild, you are helping to fund your dependency. You are helping to rebalance incentives towards core protocol work to ensure that someone talented will always be around to maintain the protocol that you depend on. It's also a great channel for retroactive public goods funding, given the foundational impact that these members have had on Ethereum's community. And lastly, as I mentioned towards the start, Ethereum's core protocol work is a public good, right? And we all know public goods are good. So by donating to the Protocol Guild, you are helping to support public goods. Let's talk about our pilot, shall we? The Protocol Guild was inspired by a tweet from Danny Ryan back in October of 2021, where he called on Ethereum's community to establish the norm that projects built on Ethereum donate a portion of their tokens towards core protocol development. A few months later, the Protocol Guild was announced, and in May of last year, the Protocol Guild was, actually May of last year, the Protocol Guild's one-year pilot was launched. What happened during that time? Well, the membership grew from 90 members at the start to 142 members today. That happened via the addition of 71 members and the removal of 19 members. During that time, Ethereum's ecosystem and community generously donated over $13 million in value, which is worth around $16 million today. We received almost 5,000 donations. And shout out to the top 5 donors, Arbitrum, Lido, Uniswap, ENS, MolochDAO, and NounsDAO, for helping to seed the pilot. But of course, the Protocol Guild isn't just about receiving donations, it's also about distributing those donations. And accordingly, over $11 million in value has been distributed to Ethereum's core protocol contributors today. That represents approximately $70,000, which, depending on where you live, is either a nice bonus or it's a full year's salary. Ultimately, we want to get to a place where, regardless of where you live, that amount is high enough to incentivize you to stick around as a contributor for the long term. What have members been up to during this time? They've been pretty busy. You may have heard about their success with the merge and withdrawals. More recently, they're focusing on the next hard fork, which is centered around proto-danksharding, which will scale layer 2s by orders of magnitude. But the reality is they're working on a large amount of very exciting things for Ethereum's ecosystem, which will help scale and secure it over the long term. But I need to make a clarification here. The Protocol Guild as an entity is in no way responsible for the planning or execution of Ethereum's core protocol development roadmap. right? The Protocol Guild is simply a funding mechanism to help support the individuals who are doing this work. We've learned one or two things during our pilot. Let's talk about the good stuff. Number one, I think it's fair to say, given the volume of donations, we've received buy-in from Ethereum's ecosystem and community, which we are incredibly grateful for. We've also received pretty good feedback from members who said that today already the financial incentives are significant enough to be relevant in discussions to join or leave core protocol work. And lastly, if we look at this on-chain membership registry today, we think it represents a reasonably accurate snapshot of Ethereum's core protocol contributor set, which means self-curation is working. There are some things that we could do better, especially if we want to scale our fundraising, which, spoiler, we do. Number one, we will need to make changes to our smart contract architecture to remove trusted dependencies. We will need to move our governance on-chain. Today it's off-chain. And of course, if we want to multiply our impact, we will need to multiply our funding. So overall, the one-year pilot represented a successful proof of concept in our minds. And so accordingly, I'm very excited to tell you about what we plan to do next. We have been working on Protocol Guild v2 for a number of months already, longer than I care to admit. And there are three key parts to Protocol Guild v2. The first one is to upgrade our smart contract architecture to remove trusted elements, right? We need to replace our multi-sig dependencies, we need to automate registry updates, and we need to expand this mechanism to layer 2s. And so we are in the process of building a modular smart contract architecture, which has 3 modules. The first module will handle all finances, and it's actually unchanged from the pilot. We have been using smart contracts written by the team over at 0x Splits for vesting and distribution of vested funds. Shout out to 0x Splits team for that. They have been working beautifully since the start of the pilot. We will continue using them for the foreseeable future. Again, that will handle all finances. The second module is for governance, and we will be leveraging a Moloch v3 DAO. Shout out to Deacon, Rowdy, Santiago from the DAO House crew for helping us set this up. The DAO will be used for governance decisions related to updating our on-chain membership registry. The last module will, of course, be the actual on-chain membership registry itself, which will live separately from the DAO. The way all this will work together, very briefly, is that we will have our DAO populated with members of the Protocol Guild who can create proposals to add or remove members, at which point there will be a voting period. Once a proposal is passed and executed, it will update the membership registry, at which point a separate function can be triggered to push the membership registry into the vesting contracts to update the recipient list there. In terms of expanding the mechanism to layer 2s, during the pilot, we consolidated all donations from layer 2s onto mainnet. We are now planning on doing the opposite, I guess. We're planning on deploying vesting contracts onto all the various layer 2 chains so that donations on layer 2s can vest on those chains as well. But we'll share more information about this in the coming weeks. The second part of Protocol Guild v2, we intend to raise $100 million over 4 years. That represents approximately a 2.5-fold increase over what we raised for the pilot. And we think that will put us a step in the right direction towards rebalancing incentives towards core protocol work, right? Ideally, we want to get to a place where compensation for Ethereum's core protocol work is comparable on a risk-adjusted basis to work for apps or layer 2s. But, of course, raising 100 million is difficult, and it's not exactly something that we want to have to do proactively forever. Which brings us to the third point of Protocol Guild v2. We want to establish the norm that all projects built on Ethereum donate 1% of their initial token supply, of their revenue, of their profit towards Ethereum's core protocol development via the Protocol Guild. Why? Because this is the only way that Ethereum's core protocol development can have a truly sustainable financing mechanism that doesn't rely on the Ethereum Foundation or other charitable entities, and also doesn't rely on proactive fundraising, which is kind of what I'm doing here today. This will be hard, but we believe that Ethereum's ecosystem has the necessary culture and values to adopt this norm. And hey, shout out to some of the early trailblazers who have already adopted this norm. When Protocol Guild v2? Soon? In true Ethereum core protocol development fashion, it'll be ready when it's ready, but I guess soon, so follow us on Twitter and we'll tell you when. And that's it. Thank you all so much for being here today. Thank you to everyone who contributed to our pilot. If you want to contribute in a non-financial way, you can go to the other building and go to the Octant booth. They have a public goods funding mechanism where you will get a POAP where you can vote on funding to be allocated to a bunch of different public goods projects, including the Protocol Guild. So please participate in that, and thank you all for being here today.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience?
Hi, Cheeky. So you guys have this massive treasury sitting there. Have you guys thought about NV2 having it generate revenue in any way?
Yeah, we thought about that for V1 already. And although it's tempting, we don't necessarily want to. If we start actively managing our treasury, right, which in theory should just be sitting there vesting, one could argue that we are no longer being incredibly neutral, right? Imagine we dump certain tokens for other tokens. That's a can of worms we don't even want to get involved in. And the reality is, it's kind of like, you know, seed investing. We're hoping to encourage these early stage crypto projects to donate a portion of their token supply, right? Will they be successful? We don't know, right? But that's okay. Like, as long as we're all doing this together, establishing the norm, then we're incredibly grateful for every single donation. But I wouldn't expect us to start actively managing this treasury, no.
Adding to the previous question, you can stake the ETH, and that would be neutral. But my question is as follows. I've just seen Grief Green presentation on public goods financing. And what she mentioned, like the model that I see is around for a while, is that you issue a token, you create the need for that token, and this is what Ethereum does in a way. So do you see perhaps that should be like just a tax on a block, because that would be like a more efficient, and probably this is something that you could, as a protocol guild, could just code that this is not like 1% from the projects, but it's 1% from the block reward. And it sounds like a joke when I see your reaction, but I'm absolutely serious. Perhaps this is something you should lobby for.
Taking a portion of block rewards to support Ethereum's core protocol development has been done by other layer ones. It will never be Ethereum that does that. Again, it infringes on credible neutrality. One could argue that it empowers these developers to like an oligopoly kind of thing. Ethereum's governance doesn't work in that way, and nor could protocol guild members band together and code such a feature, and then there's all these different stopgaps that exist to prevent that from happening. I encourage you all to check out Tim Bako's presentation from yesterday. He talks about this in detail about why this is not possible. From my perspective, we don't need to stake our ETH, because there are other public goods projects out there, like Octant, sir, who are staking their ETH and giving it potentially to different public goods projects, right? We're never going to infringe on the credible neutrality of Ethereum. This is a core tenet of us, so it's not something that we'll do.
Hi. So I want to ask you specifically, you mentioned that the list is self-governing or let's say, curating. When somebody is a member, what exactly does the person specifically do to curate the list on a daily, weekly, monthly, whatever basis?
Yeah, so today, and this is where I talked about I guess I didn't really talk about it, but I mentioned off-chain governance. And so we actually have a private GitHub repository where members can propose or basically create PRs to add or remove members, right? And so we have different members who will then come in, look at that PR, and say, do they agree or do they not agree? And so there will be a deliberation period on this PR. But in essence, at this point, there is no kind of formal process. It kind of works in the same way as Ethereum's core protocol development, which is rough consensus, right? We ultimately always come to an agreement. And I would also say that the self-curation is one layer of the curation of the protocol guild's members, right? But since a lot of these members are also employed by teams, right? Maybe client teams or whatever else, that in a way is also a curation layer, because if those people are employed by those teams, then that kind of vouches for the work that they're doing. It kind of vouches for their legitimacy, right? But yeah, when it comes to in our private GitHub, what we're doing, people can just basically comment on this. And today there haven't been any scandals. There hasn't been any major disagreement on this. Obviously, with our V2 smart contract architecture, this will all be done in a DAO.
Hi, curious to know if during the creation, the ideation of this protocol guild and when you guys were doing the pilot, were there any privacy concerns around the set of 142 addresses on chain? I know you said that some devs could opt out and it's all like opt-in, totally voluntary, but have there been a lot of devs that were like, no, I'm not going to do this because I don't want my address like labeled as a core dev? Are there any Dune dashboards where like people are tracking where those funds go from? Like, so that's the protocol, but like I'm just wondering if there's like people that are like kind of searching like 142 addresses, they're all core devs, like where is that money going? Any privacy concerns around those addresses being public?
Yeah, it's a good question. And the 142 members, or all Protocol Guild members, that list is public, right? It's an on-chain membership registry, so everyone can see those addresses. It is up to the members themselves if they want to associate that with an address that is maybe tied to their ENS or whatever else, right? So they can practice OPSEC in any way that they want to, right? Some members, they have actually tied it to their main ENS, so everyone knows that that's theirs, right? Then others have used a brand new address, a brand new EOA specifically for the Protocol Guild. And so if members are privacy conscious in that way, then they can just use a brand new EOA. Then the flip side of that is, I guess, like we talk about transparency being like a key value of Ethereum. How transparent should the Protocol Guild be? Does that transparency include doxing members and doxing their addresses? Probably it shouldn't, right? But as of right now, we basically given members the flexibility to make that judgment call themselves.
Thank you.